In this video, we're going to take a look at one of the main types of texturing in Blender, procedural textures. Blender has many ways of doing procedural textures, and in this video, we'll look at the gradient blend type. Procedural textures are internal, mathematically generated texture, as opposed to an image or movie texture that would be an external image that was mapped to the geometry. For this lesson, I've created a blend file called Gradient Blend in the Assets. It contains a plane with a blue diffuse color, a cylinder, a cube, and a sphere, all of which have no materials. I have an additional hemi-lamp in the scene, as well as an image window open for rendering. Let's select that plane object and go to the material editor. As you can see, I have a blue diffuse material applied named Blue. Now let's go to the texture context icon and bring up our texture editor. Now if I had any textures already in my scene, I'd be able to link my plane material to them by selecting them in my ID data drop-down box, which is located here. And that will list all of the textures currently in the scene. But we haven't created any textures yet, so let's get to that. Let's click next to that on the New button. By default, Blender will give us a texture type of image or movie, though if you're working on an older version, it may be clouds. Either way, we'll click on the drop-down box and choose the procedural texture Blend. There are many ways to use the blend texture. In this video, we'll focus on using it to create a gradient diffuse color. Note in the blend panel, the default is linear and horizontal. Below that, in the mapping panel, our default coordinates are UV and flat. Making alterations to these two panels are how we'll achieve the majority of our results in this lesson. Now, we don't want to work in only black and white, so we'll take a cue from previous videos. Let's open the color panel and check our ramp setting, giving us access to the creation of color ramps in our blend texture. The ramp controls here work the same way as the controls in our previous lessons. Let's change our color setting on our left marker to a yellow gold color and bring the alpha up to 1. And then let's set our right marker to a dark magenta, again with the alpha set to 1. Ah, color wheels. Nice! Now one of the first things we want to change is how Blender is mapping these coordinates. The default UV setting is for objects that have their coordinates UV'd by the user, which is the typical method for setting coordinates. We'll get to this further down the line, as right now we're using procedural color on simple objects, and we have no need for that yet. Let's change UV to generated, and we'll leave the projection as flat since it's a plane. If we scroll further, we can see that the default influence is color, in this case the blue that we created. Don't worry about that for now. Let's just do a render. When we look at our texture, rendered horizontally, it seems backwards. The ramp seems to place vertically, unless you think of the changes in the gradient as being horizontal. Really, in the end, don't worry about it too much. It's 3D. It's really all a matter of perspective. And as we say, all CG is just sleight of hand. If you want the gradient to run the other way, simply check vertical and re-render as so. As in previous video, if we lower the alpha of the magenta, in this case let's do say 25%, and re-render it, we see that the texture is also blended with the blue material it's linked to. Now as a good practice, let's go ahead and name our texture. Well, you can name it whatever you like. I'll call mine magenta gold, because some creativity. If we look above, in our outliner, we can see that we have a plane object with a plane mesh, a blue material, and the magenta gold texture linked to that material. We'll look again at that later. For now, let's select our sphere and go to the material editor. We have no material, so let's create a new one and call it red, green, blue. Again, creative. We can then go to our texture icon and create a new texture. And again, we'll use the blend setting. Let's name this tricolor. Now, we've created this kind of ramp color before, so it should look familiar. Let's go ahead and check our ramp checkbox. Then let's set our left marker to blue with full alpha. And now our right marker, either by clicking on it or using our color stop menu to choose. Let's make this one a bright red, also with full alpha. Now for tricolor, we're going to need a third color. So we'll add a stop in the middle by hitting Control and left click, or by using our Add button. This one we can make a bright green. We can make sure it's centered by changing its position box to exactly 0.5. Now, for now we can leave it at linear and horizontal, but we do need to remember to change our coordinate mapping. We'll change that from UV to generated again. Let's render. We get a nice even blend across our sphere. Now we could change from flat to sphere, and in this case you would really see little difference. Don't worry about that for now, just run with it. We can try some of the different progressions as well. Let's go up and try rendering with the quadratic progression. This progression's equation starts with a large allocation to the first marker and decreases the allocation with each marker on. So in this case, we get a lot of blue and very little red. We can also try easing, which gives us a very smooth transition. Alright, let's go back and select your plane object and try some of these different progressions. The plane object will make a good flat surface to see the differences on. Feel free to pause right now and spend a little bit here. Some of the progressions are similar, but with slight differences in their algorithms that will change the look a little bit. Once you've done that, let's select our cylinder. We'll make a new material again and name it to blend. Now let's go to the texture tab. This time we'll do something a little different. Remember when we started and I talked about the texture drop-down box? Let's go in there now and assign our tricolor texture to our cylinder. Immediately we should note that the number 2 appears next to our texture name. This is telling us that the texture is linked to 2 separate materials in our scene. If we go up to our outliner and start pulling down, we can see that it's attached to both our sphere and now to our cylinder. Now if we edit, it's going to change this texture for both of our objects. We don't want that. So if we come down and we click on that number 2, it makes it independent of the original texture. You can see the name change to include the 001. Now we can edit this texture without affecting the texture that was applied to the sphere. If we render, we get a kind of wild mapping on our tube. Well, that's because we need to remember to set our mapping coordinates from UV to generated and change it over to tube. I'm also going to go back and set the blend progression back to linear, and then we'll re-render. Now let's try changing our interpolation setting. Let's choose constant, which will keep our colors from blending. You can see that the red disappears. Constant displays as a constant color after your marker, until another marker is reached. So the red is still there, we just can't see it displayed at the moment. Let's move our green marker to about 1/3 and pull our red marker back to about 2/3. Again, let's try a render. Now let's try it with a B-spline, which creates very soft edges. You're starting to see all the different ways we can change even one basic texture. If we switch to vertical, we'd expect the texture to alter its direction. But once we render, we see some unexpected results. The texture has basically spun around the tube instead of changing the direction of the projection. This is caused by the tube shape. In this case, instead of using vertical, we'll go back to horizontal, and then we're going to go down and swap our X and our Z coordinates in our mapping panel. When we render, we see the result is what we're looking for. Many times in more complex scenes or objects, mapping can take a little trial and error. I wanted you to see that and get used to the idea that you may need to do that from time to time. Now, let's select our cube and create a new material called Cube Blend. Again, we'll go to our texture icon and we'll also create a new texture. I'm going to name it Pinkie Pie, just because. At this point, things should be very familiar. Let's change our type of blend. Let's change our type to blend. Let's go ahead and check our ramp checkbox. Let's set our left marker to a full deep red with full alpha, and our right marker to a pink with full alpha. We'll go down and we'll change our mapping coordinates to generated and cube, and then we'll render. There's our horizontal blend. Now, if we change to vertical and re-render again, once again we don't get what we'd expect. We get a horizontal blend, but just on a different axis. You should have an idea of how to fix this now. We'll go back to horizontal, and we'll switch our X and our Z axis again. And if we re-render, we get the expected results. Or do we? Now, what if we had wanted to have the red on top instead of the bottom? Then we wouldn't have our expected result. This is kind of a trick question because I've been talking about coordinates the entire time. Don't overthink this one with complicated coordinates. Just remember that you can always go up and just flip your gradient blend in your ramp panel. If we re-render, there we go. Alright, that should cover gradient blend textures pretty thoroughly. I'll see everyone in the next video.